Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'm Jack Daly, Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th Annual John H. Glenn Lecture. As a museum with dual commitments to history and science, we focus our activities in three major areas: aviation, space exploration, and planetary studies. Tonight's event is guided by our mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Since it was inaugurated in 2004, the John H. Glenn Lecture stands out as one of the most popular events of our annual calendar, and tonight is no exception. In addition to the more than 1,000 people who secured tickets to be with us here in the museum, thousands more will be watching on our webcast. 50 years ago, on the 5th of May, 1961, America began its journey into human spaceflight with when Alan Shepard traveled into space in Freedom 7, followed by Gus Grissom in July. The Mercury project achieved its goal of orbiting the Earth when John Glenn became the first American to do so in February of 1962. And 3 months later, Scott Carpenter became the second. Tonight, these two American pioneers will share their thoughts about the first human spaceflights. As it was last year, the John Glenn Lecture was made possible through the generous support of the Boeing Company. Over the years, the Boeing Company has partnered with the Smithsonian on many important projects, including construction of the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. The building's central hangar is named the Boeing Aviation Hangar in recognition of Boeing's generosity. Representing the Boeing Company here tonight is Mr. Leo Brooks, Vice President, National Security and Space. And Leo, would you please stand and be recognized? It's important to point out that none of these programs would be possible without sponsorship, and so we are deeply indebted to Boeing for its consistent support of many of our activities. Moderating tonight's discussion will be Margaret Weidekamp, curator in the museum's Division of Space History. Dr. Weidekamp is the curator for the social and cultural dimensions of spaceflight. Among her duties is the coordination of this annual lecture series. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Margaret Weidekamp. Margaret?
Good evening. Welcome to the National Air and Space Museum. For this evening's John H. Glenn Lecture in Space History, we are honored to have as our speakers tonight two original Project Mercury astronauts, Senator John H. Glenn and Commander M. Scott Carpenter. As we prepared for this conversation, which will focus on the early days of American human spaceflight, Senator Glenn reminded me of the numbers involved in selecting the first 7 astronauts. When the National Aeronautics and Space Administration began looking for astronauts, they reviewed the records of 508 military jet test pilots. 110 qualified. 69 were interviewed, 53 volunteered, and 32 went through the best screening process that NASA could devise. I'll let our speakers tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But when John Glenn began NASA's selection process, he was a Marine Corps aviator who had flown 59 combat missions during World War II. In the Korean conflict, he flew 63 missions with the Marine Fighter Squadron and another 27 missions with the Air Force in the F-86 Saberjet. In the last 9 days of fighting in Korea, Glenn downed 3 MiGs in combat along the Yalu River. He was also a record setter, holding a transcontinental speed record from Los Angeles to New York in 3 hours and 23 minutes. I'm sorry, sir. As he joins us tonight, he is a veteran of 2 space flights. His history-making mission as the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962, and also as a mission specialist on STS-95 in 1998. And we're here at the museum, we're particularly delighted that his second spacecraft, the Space Shuttle Discovery, will be joining his first, Friendship 7, in our collection next year. Elected to the United States Senate in 1974, Senator Glenn served with distinction for 25 years, finally leaving office in 1999. In addition to all of that, Senator Glenn is a great friend to us here at the museum, and we're honored to have him with us tonight. When Scott Carpenter began NASA's astronaut selection process, he was a naval aviator with a degree in aeronautical engineering from the University of Colorado. It's really fitting this year, 2011, which is also the centennial of naval aviation, that we have such two distinguished aviators as our speakers this evening. During the Korean War, Commander Carpenter served with Patrol Squadron 6. By 1959, when NASA began its process, he had graduated from Navy Test Pilot School and was serving as the Air Intelligence Officer on the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. As he joins us here tonight, he is both an astronaut and an aquanaut. In 1962, he became the second American to orbit the Earth aboard Aurora 7. But in 1965, with the Navy's Man in the Sea project, he spent 30 days living and working on the ocean floor. At NASA, he brought that interest in diving to developing underwater crew training. When Commander Carpenter retired from the Navy after 25 years of service, he founded Sears Sciences Incorporated, continuing his interests in diving and the world's oceans. He's the author of 2 novels and a memoir. He's a businessman, an astronaut, a deep-sea diver, and tonight we're delighted that he is one of our speakers. Please help me in welcoming John Glenn and Scott Carpenter to the stage.
Thank you. Where we go? Here.
Musical chairs.
Okay. These are high.
Is everyone comfortable?
Yes, ma'am.
I seem to be up elevated here. Okay.
Let me hold it. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Senator Glenn, did you want to begin?
I'll be glad to, and I welcome everybody here tonight, and we thank Boeing for sponsorship, as General Daly has said, very much. But you know, to be asked to participate in a 50th anniversary celebration of the early days of manned spaceflight is a difficult task in 2 respects, because it's sort of an exercise in nostalgia, number one, and then it seems strange to be talking about the early days of Mercury without having all of that whole first 7 group here with us. Scott and I are the only 2 left. 5 of them have passed on now for various reasons, but so it's difficult to speak about some of these things, because that was a group that was dedicated to things never tried before in this country or anywhere around the world, as far as that goes. Dedicated to starting that manned program. There were days of the Cold War. That was the impetus. We were determined to get back in this thing, even though we'd been outdone to begin with. And it was a group dedicated to a task that it was a very difficult task, and it was a highly competitive group because every person in that first group wanted to be on every mission. That's the reason we had all volunteered for that. But when the time came for a mission, there wasn't any competition anymore. Everybody united completely in getting behind whoever was in the cockpit that particular time and making sure that it was a good mission. So it'd be well this evening if we just thought about this as Scott and I hear we're glad to be representing that whole group of 7. I wish they were all here with us tonight. It was a great group. But some of the days of what it was like back then and what the selection process that selected the 7, the training we went through, and some of those early missions is what we'll be talking about this evening. So thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Good. Would you like to say a few words about your colleagues?
I was hoping you would ask. Yes, I have to begin my part of this by saying I too am proud to be asked to be a part of the John Glenn Lecture Series, but I must remark the fact that I am no stranger to John Glenn's lectures. I was his backup pilot, and I heard a lot of lectures from John telling me what to do to his space capsule that made it work right. So, John, I'm glad to be asked to lecture again. I listened to a lot to which I was not asked. Anyway, it's a pleasure to see you.
As a
here.
backup, if I had caught the measles the day before, you know who'd have gone to.
Well, I have to say this. You brought it up. When John got the second flight on the shuttle, I said to him that I'd be glad to be his backup again, but that this time I'd make sure he broke a leg so I could. But then it occurred to me to say to him, but John, NASA probably wouldn't let me do that because I'm not old enough to be.
Zap.
Did you want to say a few words about why the human spaceflight program began, about the Cold War context and President Kennedy, and what really began this race into space?
Yeah, I think people today sort of forget what the international situation was back in those days when we were first starting. The Soviets at that time had been taking thousands of kids into Russia for their education, and been sending them back to their countries as indoctrinated little communists. And there was a lot of writing about was communism going to at least be in part of the determining factor for the rest of history. And it was getting a lot of credibility. And they were saying that they were superior to us in technology and in research. And to prove this, they were saying, look at their missiles. And their missiles had been orbiting while ours had been blowing up, too often had been blowing up on the launch pad. So it was in those depths of the Cold War and sort of a comeback that you almost went into some of those early flights as a combat mission, because it was that important for our country that we not be looked at as a second-rate nation around the world. And so that was one of the driving forces for it. President Kennedy was aware of all this and was very much for the program. And so that was sort of the early days.
I think of one thing to say with regard to, got to say one other thing about being not old enough. John's idea for the flight that he took on the shuttle was to prove that an old man, and we were both old then, but he wanted to prove that an aged man could stand the stresses just as well as a young man, and he did that. And it was very valuable experiment to a lot of old fellows.
Well, we got to sort of jumped over Mercury there, but let me just comment on that briefly. The reason I was up on that second flight, I was 77, and as you get older, some of your faculties change. They really do, and NASA has plotted some 52 changes in the human body occur in space. Things like the body's immune system gets weaker in space. Well, that happens to old folks here. The ability of the body to replace protein in the muscles, PTO, protein turnover, is more difficult in space than it is for older folks too. The purpose of the flight then was to try and see if we could find similarities or differences between me and the younger people that would let us get a clue as to what within the human body turns these systems on and off, making it possible maybe for younger people to go longer in space, longer missions. And the important to me was to take away frailties of old age right here on Earth. So that was really the purpose of me being on the second flight.
You spoke a little bit about the testing that you were doing on that orbital flight. I'm very interested in getting us talking about the testing that you did as a part of the selection process. How did you first hear about NASA's astronaut selection and the beginnings of the human spaceflight program?
Go ahead.
I was a naval officer on the carrier Hornet, and I got orders signed by CNO saying, well, those of you who don't know CNO, that stands for the Chief of Naval Operations, top man in the Army. And for others who don't understand these affairs, CNO to a junior naval officer is 2 steps above God. And when you get orders from CNO, you obey. The orders said, report to Washington at such and such a time. Do not discuss or speculate with anyone for the reason about the reason of these orders. And so I obeyed. I did discuss and speculate with my wife, however, but I went to a briefing at the Pentagon, and that's how I heard about the NASA project.
I don't really remember where I first heard about it. There were some rumors that when I was in the old Bureau of Aeronautics at that time. I'd just come off a test duty at about 3.5 years of doing test work at Patuxent River, Maryland, Naval Air Test Center. And there were rumors at that time, and the old NACA, NASA's predecessor, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was doing some studies on a computer they had down at Langley that were about orbital flight. And they wanted someone to come down there and sort of go through some of that. And I went down, I volunteered for that. And that's when I think we first realized that we really were going into this, or I realized anyway.
What kinds of tests were done to determine your physical fitness and your psychological fitness for becoming an astronaut?
Well, I think on the screen you have those were the basic conditions that they were looking for at that time. And I won't repeat those now, but I think one of the things was they put us through the most complete physical exams that they knew how to do medically possible back at that time. Dr. Randy Lovelace had been in charge of at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, had been in charge of high altitude research on pilots, and he had a Lovelace clinic out at Albuquerque. And we were sent out to Albuquerque, and it was such hush-hush then we even signed in under assumed names, as I recall. I don't remember what my name was, but anyway, we reported in, and they ran the most complete physicals you ever saw in your life, everything that was possible. The couple of things that were different than anything I've ever done on a physical ever since then that I recall was one of the tests was you went in and you put your bare feet into a bucket of ice water. And that gets rather painful after a little while. And that was supposed to be a test of later in life whether you're going to have high blood pressure or not. Now, I don't know whether we have a I imagine there's a doctor or two in the house here. We ought to ask their opinion of that test today. And the other one that is still used, I think, is that was not on a regular physical I'd ever taken before, was cold water, not ice water, but cold water in the ear, poured in your ear, and that makes your the fluid in the vestibular part of your ear, the inner ear canals, move randomly, and gives you a nystagmus, which means you can't keep your eyes focused on a particular point, and that the more cold water they put in, the more your eyes would twitch and go to the side, and then they would time. Once they stopped that time, how long it took for your eyes to recenter and get control of your eyes. So those are two that I remember in particular out there at Lovelace. And then we moved back to Wright-Pat for a whole battery of tests later on. Scott, what are your recollections of Albuquerque? Anything different? Or?
Well, yes. You characterized the test that NASA gave us best by saying everything they could think of that would be possible to test, they did to us, mainly because nobody knew what stresses the human body would be subjected to by the rigors of spaceflight. So they tested us under all sorts of conditions. Many of those tests were not applicable to spaceflight because they involved stresses that didn't occur in space, so the testing and training changed as a result of that. A lot of the things they did to us are no longer done because they didn't tell us anything that related to spaceflight. Except, I have to accept that the cold water, that your feet in cold water, that had purpose. But you, on the surface, you have to realize that you don't need, in order to fly in space, to be able to keep your feet in cold water. It does, however, give the medical people a way to measure perseverance. And perseverance, of course, is required in any major effort like this, and putting your feet in cold water does measure perseverance. So that was a valuable test, and there were others. John mentioned the nystagmus that the cold water does to your ears. That was also induced by another training device that went by the acronym MASTIF. It stands for Multi-Axis Spin Test Inertial Facility. And that tested your ability to recover quickly from the nystagmus that is also induced by rapid tumbling, which around all three axes, which was suspected to perhaps be present when we were separated from the booster, but it never happened. Nystagmus never was a stress experienced in spaceflight, but we sure did experience it in the training.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we went back to, after Lovelace, we went back to Wright-Patterson for all the things that they knew how to do back there, measuring responses on the human body to different stimuli. And that was quite a list of things, and I don't know whether we have a list of that to put up here or not, but one was, we wrote at 4 Gs, 4 times gravity, and the 25-foot arm centrifuge they had there at Wright-Pat. Some of the other things, we had a heat chamber, and this shows to some extent what Scott said a minute ago about NASA was really going overboard on just trying to cover everything that they could measure in all these tests to see how you responded, not knowing exactly how you were going to, what was going to happen. The heat chamber, you had a rectal thermometer in that was remotely, they could read it outside. The let your body soak, I think we're in the heat chamber at 135 degrees. A sound chamber where they could change the volume and the frequency of sound, make it so your whole body just literally shook when you're in that one. And just the opposite of that, a chamber that was no sound and no light, called an echoic chamber, with baffles in there that reduced the sound to nothing and no light, and see how they didn't tell you how long you were going to be in there. But they had sensors on you that were read outside to show how much tension you were under in that kind of an isolated situation, which I suppose did have some relation to the isolation of space. They had a shake test on a vibration chair where you shook again. They had a strobe light test where the body's nervous system responds to different frequencies, and one of the frequencies that was supposed to be particularly bad, and I think is still used maybe to some extent today, was strobe light flashing in your eye at 10 cycles per second. And to some people that carries you sort of over the edge. They get so they can't control themselves at that. And so that was a test also. An altitude chamber up to 35,000 feet, and take your mask off and see how what response you had there. Tilt table, taking different actions, and reaction time measurements. Those are ones that I can remember that we did physically, and then of course there were whole batteries of psychological tests we went through, and we could talk some about that too.
I was just going to ask you. Could you tell us a little bit about the psychological tests that they did?
Yeah, that's they had a questionnaire. I looked this up the other day. The first questionnaire they gave us when we checked in was to answer 566 questions. 566 questions. You had to write your little answer out to each one of them, and they covered different things. They give us Rorschach tests. You know, the Rorschach, the ink blot test, separate them. You always look like
We have one up behind you.
you do. All right,
Yeah.
good. Oh, didn't know we had
We
that.
wonder
many.
what you
Okay.
see.
I always look like butterflies of one kind or another to me. But they were. There was a little joke back at that time too, I might say, about the psychiatrists showing these ink blots of the Rorschach tests, and every one of them, the subject said, "Oh, that was something." He described some very pornographic event. And this went on. I won't carry this out. He could, but went through about 5 or 6 of these. Every time the guy would describe some brand new psychological event or pornographic event. And finally the psychiatrist said, "Look, everything I show you, you seem to come up with something pornographic. Why do you think that is?" And the guy said, "I don't know, Doc. You're the one showing the dirty pictures." But anyway, we went through all of that and Rorschach tests, and then one I thought you might try at home tonight too after you go home. I am blank. And give a minimum of 20 answers. And you get brownie points for all over 20. But you get up, most people I think get up to about 16 or 17. I am man, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an officer, I'm a whatever. You keep on and on and on, everything you can think of. And that was sort of an interesting one too. There were been reports back from some of the psychiatrists at that time that they thought that space travel might be so euphoric that you might not, they had what they called the breakaway phenomena, that you might not really want to come back at the end of this once you're up there. And I never took that one very seriously, I can tell you that. But I thought one of the humorous things that did happen, and this was one that you may have heard before because we've used it several times, maybe in some of the lectures here even. But Pete Conrad was on, who's no longer with us, but Pete Conrad was on that first selection group. And Pete was a great guy, had a sense of humor like you wouldn't believe, and always had a joke about something or other. Pete came in and the psychiatrist slid a piece of white paper across in front of him, just with nothing on it like that, slid a piece of white paper across in front of him on the table, and said, "Mr. Conrad, what do you see there?" And without batting an eye, Pete turned it around and slid it back to him and said, "Well, first thing I see is you have it upside down." Pete was not selected on the first go round. But anyway, we went through every psychiatric test that they knew how to run at that time. And anyway, I guess we were the ones that came out good. We never knew whether they selected the ones that were nuts or not. But anyway, that was.
Unbeknownst,
Please.
let me carry on for just a second. Unbeknownst to the senator, I had occasion to test his ability one time to recover quickly from a stressful situation. We were in John's little tiny Prince automobile.
Yeah.
It had 2 cylinders, I think, had great gas mileage, went about 30 miles an hour, but John was commuting from Washington to Bethesda, and it got good gas mileage, and it was economic to run. We were in this car trying to get to the airport, which used to be called Friendship, right?
Yeah,
Wasn't it
Boston.
Friendship? It was
Baltimore.
Baltimore, Washington. We were racing down the road with the top down, trying to make an airplane. I had all our papers and our tickets and itineraries over in the windy passenger seat. And John was hell-bent to get to Friendship in a hurry. I shuffled all of the papers without the tickets into one hand and let them fly. And John saw them running past, and I said, "Oh, John, there go our tickets." And he looked at me strangely, but he kept his self-control. And I was pleased with that, and he never got mad at me, and he recovered quickly especially after I showed him that the tickets were still in my hand. He recovered very nicely.
I hope we made the airplane. I don't remember that.
When you were training to be astronauts, no one had ever had that job description before. So what did astronaut training entail?
Everything. Every test you can imagine. But we had a lot of systems to learn about. We had a lot of machinery to look at. And we had in those days, and it's no longer so, and maybe that's good, but we had total control of how that capsule was made and what it had and what it could do. And it was a good one. It was a good capsule. It flew 6 times without a failure.
It might be good at this point to talk about
It's
the weight.
The heat shield.
Well, say about the weight limit. Oh, go ahead.
Well, it's your heat shield.
I was going to say about some of the limitations before we get into what the training did and
Sure.
what the experience on the flight, because we were under very strict weight limitations. And they came about because, and this sounds backwards, we were in trouble on manned space flight as far as what we could put up there, how light it had to be, by the fact that we were better than the Russians technically, better than the Soviets technically. That sounds backwards, except it's true in that we had been able to miniaturize nuclear weapons, make small ones. And the Soviets had not been able to do that. They were still making fat boy type nuclear weapons, and so they had to have a huge booster. We had a smaller booster. The biggest booster we had was the Atlas booster, because we didn't need a big one like that. Well, then when we're using those boosters and converting them to manned spaceflight, we were limited in putting up about 4,000 pounds, where they could put up their house practically if they wanted to almost. And so we were very limited in what we could do. That's the reason that when you go out here in the outside here and look at space Friendship 7 and how small it is, it had to be well under 4,000 pounds, fully loaded, astronaut, all consumables and everything on board. And so that's the reason on the original Mercury design there was not a window, because it was going to be heavier than the structure around it. It had to have supporting structure and all, and it was very, very light and very small. And if we were going to be in the space program, we could only use the Atlas, which was the biggest booster we had at that time. So that was one of the constraints that we were really under when we went ahead. And so then I thought I'd throw that in, and then we go to training after that.
I'm going to follow up one question, then we'll go back to the training. What kind of trade-offs did you have to make in order to make that weight, in order to achieve what you wanted to do with the Mercury capsule?
Well, the engineers that designed this, they used the beryllium and titanium. They used, this is another one, this is a very important one too. They went with, instead of going at sea level pressure, as you're breathing here right now, 14.72 and a mix of about 20% oxygen and 80% nitrogen, a couple of little gases in there, but about 20% oxygen that you breathe here. Instead of doing that, they'd have to make a fairly substantial structure. They could make a lighter structure if you went with a design that went with 100% oxygen inside, 100% oxygen, and reduce the pressure then in space. And you got the same oxygen absorption rate that you would get here with a mixed gas at 14.72 here at sea level. Now, that's the way the first flights went. Our flights were all made in 100% oxygen. Now, you know what happened in high school, if you had a beaker of oxygen here and you had a glowing red hot wire and you just put that in, the thing would just burn like that. So, and that caught up with us after a while. We were lucky on Project Mercury, but it was later on the pad fire when they were still in 100% oxygen environment, the pad fire in the early Apollo mission that Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee and Ed White were killed on the launch pad, and the whole program stopped for about 2.5 years while we converted back over to a sea level pressure. But on the early days, we went with 100% oxygen in order to save weight on the structure of the vehicle itself. And so you had the same oxygen absorption as you would have here on sea level at the higher pressure, if you follow all that. So anyway, that was a very great limitation.
An interesting figure, I think, the weight of the payload, so to speak, on the Atlas. We were part of it at 150 pounds. We were told to eat carefully and don't gain any weight. The capsule itself was weight limited. John has spoken of that. Because of the rule of thumb in those days was that it takes 1,000 pounds of fuel to orbit 1 pound of payload. And we were fuel limited because of that. So if you gain too much weight, the Atlas couldn't carry enough fuel to orbit you, so it was critical.
It was very critical, and you had to what you're trying to do is get up to orbital speed, and that was about 17,500 miles per hour, which that's a big figure, but if you think about it a different way, it's almost 5 miles a second. You're trying to accelerate to almost 4.8 miles per second is what it actually is to get up to orbital speed. And so with the limitations on weight, we were very, very tight. I think at the end of the launch period, I think the figure they calculated, I had about 3 seconds of burn time left, and just got up to orbital speed and just had 3 seconds of burn time left on a 5.5 minute burn from launch up into orbit. But we could get into some of that a little later.
I do want to bring you back to some of the training that you did, because you've described that you were over-tested when you were selected, and then you essentially overtrained when you were training because you weren't sure what
Scott
you would
mentioned
encounter.
that. Go ahead. You mentioned overtraining, and I think they don't do some of the training that we did now.
Yeah, I don't think of any instances, but we were subjected to, there were so many unknowns in those days. They were unknown unknowns. And we were subjected to tests that had no relevance at all. And I can't think of any in particular, but that bear mention now, but we did a lot of work that was unnecessary because we essentially didn't know at that time what we were doing.
There were some extraordinary pieces of technology that were created in order to simulate some of the forces that you would be or possibly be encountering. Can you tell me a little bit, for instance, you mentioned the Mastiff.
I don't know how many hours you have left to talk about some of these things, but a couple of these were really things that I never want to do again, and I'm sure Scott doesn't either. They didn't know what G level you could get up to. And so we trained on the 50-foot centrifuge, 50-foot arm centrifuge that would whirl in a circle like this and keep going, keep building the G's up. And you were on the outer end of this thing, out on the end of the arm in a spacecraft, a simulated spacecraft cockpit in a unit. Yeah, there it is.
There it is.
And that thing out on the end, as you started spinning that long arm, that 50-foot trestle there, it would get up about a 4,000 horsepower engine, drove an electric motor, and drove this thing in the middle. As you went up the space capsule then, which was inside that toroidal shape or whatever it is, vehicle you rode in out there, that would tilt so that your G's were always still straight into your chest, as though you're lying down and your bed was being accelerated up. That was the direction of the G's. Now no one had established at that time what G levels you could take. And they didn't, they were trying to train us, I guess, for if there was an overshoot and you got up to higher G levels than the 7.7 planned for launch and re-entry, if you got up above that, what would happen? And so we went up and trained on that thing and started going up and up in the G levels and got up to 16 Gs. And at 16 Gs, Scott described that yesterday when we were talking about this. Go ahead about what you really had to put everything into it you ever had.
How do you endure 16 Gs?
with difficulty. I remember thinking that what came naturally, I think, to all of us, without any guidance from the medical people watching from the outside, was natural. You feel this stress that tends to drain blood from your head and your heart, and you tense every muscle in your body like you would if you were trying to clean and jerk 1,000 pounds off the floor. And that automatic response to acceleration is exactly what the doctors were telling us to do. And I thought at the time, you know, the human organism has no evolutionary experience with high acceleration. The maker didn't conceive centrifuges or spaceflight or high accelerations, but the human body is constructed with the intellect that tells it how to respond to that stress. I find that remarkable.
Yeah. Scott, you're just at 16G, you're straining every muscle in your body the maximum you possibly can to keep enough blood to keep from passing out. If you just try and relax even a hair, your vision starts closing in and you're just about to pass out. So at 16G is where we ended it because we figured we'd never go over that no matter what happened on the boosters. One other thing though that we did on the planetarium or on the centrifuge, age creeping in there, yeah, on the centrifuge, was what we called eyeballs in to eyeballs out runs. Now that unit you see there, going around on the end of the centrifuge now, and say you're up to a certain number of Gs, they can rotate that thing rotary around the round part you're looking at there so that you go from Gs into the chest to G's out of the chest, and you're coming out against the straps. And the reason that they wanted us to train on that was because if you come down in a spacecraft, and let's say the spacecraft comes down at the end of a mission, and the chute is up here, and you come down and you hit the ground, and the chute is released. If you had a 30 or 35 knot wind, and the spacecraft bounced and came down the other head first, would you come out against the straps end and break your restraint system and be killed that way instead of some other way? And so what they were trying to do was, we tested it that way then, and we went up and worked on that thing to see what we could do, see whether we needed a better restraint across the chest than just the two straps like you have in most private airplanes now. And that was all the restraint you had. The 16 Gs, of course, was taken with Gs coming straight into your chest. And that was enough, I might add, to when we got out, we had 1,000 little spots on your back where blood vessels had broken called petechiae. The doctors could describe that better, but it's little broken blood vessels that disappear after 3 or 4 days. But we're putting the bodies through some pretty tough stuff. And this was to do the other direction. So we'd get up to a certain G level, say like 3 Gs or 4 Gs, and going around, and they would rotate that simulated spacecraft on the end of the arm. It would rotate to an eyeball, from an eyeballs in position you'd been to eyeballs out on the straps, the EO position as we called it, and you'd hit the straps. And they could rotate it in about 3 seconds from one spot to the other. So you had a delta, a change of G from a positive to negative G of about, let's say at 4, you're plus 4 Gs, and they'd rotate it, you'd be at 4 Gs out, a delta of 8 Gs in about 3 seconds, and that was a tough ride. And one of the doctors up there made some runs that was the only test I ever remember where one of the doctors ran tests ahead of us. And Bill Augerson was his name. He was running these tests ahead of us. And Bill did, I think maybe it was a 6 to 6. I think we'd been up to 5 to 5. He did a 6 to 6 and came out coughing. And coughing and coughing and coughing. So they thought we'd better stop and see what was going on. And we went down to an anthropomorphic dummy that was down in the lab and started peeling the pieces off the dummy to see what happened to your internal organs. And they had the same vectors. And what they finally, the doctors came up with was that the heart had come up and actually hit behind a lung and knocked the air out of one lung. And that's why he was coughing, was because the alveoli in your lung were compressed, and it took a little while to get that back normal again. That was where we decided that the EIEO had ended right there. That was enough. So the centrifuge was pretty good. And we had another good one that you might want to
I
describe,
did want
Scott,
to
talk
ask
about
about
the
your.
Mastiff.
Well, we could
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the Mastiff. We have a good picture of that, I believe, that we can put
Yeah.
up. I can give you a minute or so to walk us through what that did to you. How did that work?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
There are 3 axes of rotation. In an airplane, you call them pitch, roll, and yaw. And we put a seat inside of 3 concentric gimbals that could rotate around 3 axes, roll, pitch, and yaw. And we built this machine that would get to pretty high rotational speeds with a man in the center, given all of the stresses to his vestibular middle ear. And then as soon as they stopped it, the cockpit was still, there would be a doctor with flashlight and magnifying glass watching your eyes stop the nystagmus and slow down. And that was to test your ability to recover from the tumbling that was expected to be present if things didn't go right when you separate from the booster on insertion to orbit. But that never happened in flight. And so although this was an interesting ride, it was not pertinent to spaceflight. But let me tell you one other thing about the centrifuge. In order to fly in space, you have to have speed. In order to get speed, you must accelerate. And if you want to get very, very fast, you must accelerate at acceptable levels for a long, long time. That would be very handy on a flight to Mars. One of the fellows who ran the centrifuge postulated that if you were to ride a centrifuge at 2 Gs, that's a simple task. 2 Gs is easy. It is important to say that Gs can be debilitating, but the debilitation is dependent on time too. You can stand 16 Gs for 5 seconds. That's what we did. But at a minute, at 16 Gs, I figure that'd be fatal.
Yeah, you'd pass
So
out.
the time at a certain G level is important too. This fellow postulated that 2 Gs for a day would give you close to relativistic speeds for a flight to Mars. And that'd be a good way to get to Mars in a hurry, is get the speed that 2 Gs for a day for 24 hours would give you. He proposed that to his boss and said, that's a good idea, let's try it, but try it on a chimp first, not you. And that was done, and the chimp died after 6 hours at 2 Gs. So we learned something from that mistaken idea.
Yeah. Back to Mastiff just a second too. You had a hand controller in there, controlled roll and pitch and yaw like that, and those were hooked up to thruster reactors then out on these arms to stop the rotation that they had induced. So it would be with about the same ratio as it would be in the spacecraft itself. And so you trained on 1 axis at a time, then 2 axis. And the graduation exercise, it really was something that's hard for me to still believe we did, but we did it. And this is one that Ralph Morris, one of the photographers from Life magazine, took. He put lights on the thing. Our graduation exercise we did 32 RPM in roll, pitch, and yaw all at the same time. if you figure you just figure if you can visualize the convolutions your body was going through. That's the reason that whole thing was known better in the astronaut group as the barf machine. But it was a real the centrifuge in that Mastiff is something I never want to really fool with again. We were overtrained on those things, that's for sure, and they don't use those now at all.
I'm going to move us forward to your flights because as you're talking about acceleration and talking about the feeling of being on the Mastiff, I'm wondering what does it feel like to launch aboard an Atlas booster?
Let me, just before you do that, if you could,
Yes, sir.
Margaret, let me just run through some of the other training, just very, very briefly here. Some of the other training we did zero-G flights in the C-131 and the F-100. We did planetarium training down at the University of North Carolina on star navigation training. If you lost all the communication with the ground, you'd still be able to look out the window with a cursor across the window. When certain stars came up, you would know to fire the retro to come down within a certain 1,000-mile area or so. We did disorientation training in a slowly revolving room where the room rotates and you're inside this room and everything just looks normal. The couch is there and so on, but then you try to move around or do something and it's very, very disorienting. We did things on the balance beam. That was one that showed me on the balance beam. Do you have the other one there? That's Scott on the balance beam. I knew I'd get back with him. I thought they included that one. Okay. And the scuba training, we did that. They thought that was good training for us, and it was. We did flight training. We had the 102, F-102 assigned to us. We did survival training on sea and desert and jungle, and I wish we had time to go into all of those. Just one little thing on that one. The only thing we lack here is smell-o-vision for that group. That was at the end of 3 days of desert training. And I always remembered there was a Master Sergeant Urban at Stead Air Force Base who gave us some of our desert training. And he told us about don't be afraid of snakes out there because if you get hit by a venomous snake, he gave the survival training for a lot of the Air Force that went through regular classes there. And then you stand, if you have a snake venom bite, you slash it with a knife and suck it out. Some people will refuse to suck it out because they're afraid it's going to get in their system and kill them. To show that that wouldn't happen, he milked a water moccasin in a little shot glass, squeezed it until it put venom in there, and it had a little venom in the bottom of the shot glass. He drank it. And he said that it's just pure protein, and it won't hurt you. But he said, if you got ulcers, don't do this, because it would kill you. And that was one I still remembered out of that kind of training. We did jungle training where they put us down through high canopy jungle and you survived for 3 days. Put down 2 people at a time. Neil Armstrong and I were a team on that one. And those are just some of the other things in addition to the things that were mentioned here. I thought I'd just mention those because we hadn't covered all the different things that we did.
Well, while you were doing that, you were also going down, I know, and at the Cape and watching the work that was being done on the Atlas booster, which was having some problems within a year or so of your flight. There were, I believe, 2 failed flights within a year of your flights. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to be preparing to launch on an Atlas booster? And again, I really want to know, what does it feel like?
Well, the first launch any of us saw was pretty interesting. We'd just been in the program a short time, and they had the Mercury Atlas adaptation. Thought that was going to be a good flight. They took us down because none of us had ever seen a missile launch. And it's going to be a night launch, and we go down there. We're on a camera pad just 2,000 or 3,000 feet from the launch site, and starless. I mean, it's a very starry night, and the searchlights are on, and it's almost like Hollywood. The steam coming off of it. Finally, comes down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It lights up, and we're watching this thing go up and up and up. And it hit the highest area of aerodynamic pressure after about a minute, 59 seconds of launch. And we're watching this thing go up, and all at once it blew up right over us. And that was our introduction to the Atlas that we were going to ride. And so it was quite impressive. As I recall, we looked at each other and wanted to have a meeting with the engineers the next morning. So that was the first one. And so we went, then there were 2 more failures in the process. But we did have two successful flights before my flight. And so the Atlas, just a comment on the side, the Atlas is a very fragile vehicle. It's made out of 16,000 stainless steel, and it had to have pressure in it all the time, or on the top ring have that in tension to hold the thing up. If you didn't have either pressure inside or something to hold it up, it would just collapse. And so it was very fragile. And what they found eventually that had been causing the problem was that when you mounted a Mercury spacecraft on there, and during launch you got some vibrations on this thin metal up right close to the vehicle that broke through and caused the whole thing to explode. And so the fix for that, that gave us the two successful missions before my flight, was to put what we called a belly band. It doubled that thickness of the booster down about 4 feet or so, down from where the spacecraft was located up on top. And that was successful, and that seemed to cure the problem, and it did through the Mercury flights.
Those 3 launches that we saw that ended so catastrophically, we called those the back to the drawing board launches.
That's right. What we had on was the Atlas, we had that first one was destroyed after 59 seconds. MA2, it was designed as a shorter flight, just to go up a little bit and then be propelled back down in the atmosphere for some checks on equipment on that. Then the next one, MA3, was a failure and destruction by the range safety officer. The thing wasn't under control and was going all over. Then we had MA4 was okay, and MA5 was okay, except it was ended at the end of 2 orbits. And I think it wasn't because there were problems with the booster. I think it was I don't remember what the reason was, but anyway, it made 2 orbits. And the next flight was a manned flight. That was my flight. So that was the history of the Atlas you asked about.
Yes. Can you tell us about your launch, sir? What does it feel like to be going up in the tower in your spacesuit, ready to make the first orbital flight for an American?
People ask quite often, what's it feel like when you're getting ready to launch? And we have a sort of a standard answer in the astronaut corps, and you may have already heard it, but it's how do you think you'd feel if you knew you were on top of 2 million parts built by the lowest bidder on a government contract? And it's not that bad, because you really you've studied this thing, you've experimented, you've gone through training, and it's really something you've looked forward to, and it's a time period of great concentration, and you're glad to get going. Lift off the launch pad after all the training at different G levels. I know a lot of people think you're under your maximum stress when you're lifting off the launch pad because of all the fire and the steam and everything going out. It looks bad, but if you think about it, that's the heaviest that's the heaviest condition you're going to ever be in. And so that applied thrust there, you lift off very gently. I remember being very amazed at how gentle liftoff. I didn't know for sure until I saw the clock start, and I knew that was, and that's what I said on it's on the recording of the flight, was the clock is operating, we're underway. And so he's very gentle, but you're accelerating on up. Your launch back at that time was about 5.5 minutes from launch pad into orbit. And so you go up, your outside booster engines come off, and you continue on the sustainer engine then. That is the one that takes you into orbit. And that's where you're down to lightweight, and that's the toughest part, that's the hardest part of the launch, because you're running right up, peaking up right up to the maximum Gs, about 7.7 Gs in that same position again, just as you get into orbit, and then you're cut off, and you go from 7.7 Gs to 0. And that's a good transition. You're happy with that. And then the first thing I'm sure I was waiting for at that time was a call from the ground that their radar tracking showed that it was a good orbit, and I wasn't going to get cut down and told to retrofire immediately to come down short of Africa, because you don't have full orbital speed, and so you're going to come down someplace. And the maximum that you were prepared to go, if you had to, at the end of this thing, was 7 orbits, and that's the one that was always used as a signal that you were okay to go for orbital flight, was that you're cleared to go for 7, and that was the most welcome message just about I'd ever had, I think. So the liftoff itself is very gentle, but your main part of the is the acceleration up there, where you just as you're inserted into orbit is where you're at their maximum G level.
And as you watch the progress of this flight, the thing that I remember is the gradual loss of blue sky, and it gets black.
Mhm.
And I remember looking at the instruments we had, which really dropped out of any meaningful measurement at 100,000 feet. And I remember looking at my altimeter that said something over 90,000 feet. And I looked outside. That's probably, we didn't have a Mach measurement, but you're looking out at a totally black sky. See an altimeter reading of over 90,000 feet and realizing that you're going straight up. And the thought crossed my mind, what am I doing? But it's a beautiful, that's when people ask, what is it like? I think of three things, meaning orbital flight. The view is unforgettable, and the weightlessness is the greatest thing that's ever happened to your body. And the view and of Mother Earth and the weightlessness is an addictive combination of senses.
In that picture you're looking at, you can see the curvature of the Earth up there. Now, we weren't very high on those first flights. That curvature becomes more pronounced the higher you get. Of course, as the first flights ran up about 160 statute miles, something like that. And so that's the curvature you see from that altitude. I don't know which pictures we have here, but we took that weight thing again and distraction of the astronaut. The original idea was not to have a window in the spacecraft and not to have the astronaut take a camera because it would be distracting. And one of the cameras on display, we had it out of the case out here yesterday, was a camera that Bob Gilruth finally approved to take just a couple of months before the flight. And then NASA didn't even have a photo shop down there then at the Cape. And one day I was in getting a haircut. Those were days when I still got haircuts. And got a haircut, and next door was I saw the first of the Minolta Highmatic cameras, which was the first one that had automatic exposure to it. And we didn't have a camera yet, and I bought that, and NASA still owes me $45 for that camera. But that's the one, the camera that is on display here, that's the one that I used up there. It was called an ANSCO. That was one of the either subsidiary or they owned Minolta or something in the States at that time. There was a Minolta camera that had automatic, you can see the solar, whatever it is down here, the pictures down there right above the hand. We tried, one reason I got it too, we wanted a camera that you could work it with the forefinger to trip the picture and use the thumb for film transport. It didn't have automatic film transport. And so that was the camera that was used. It was out of a drugstore down there at that time because it was sort of a last add-on before the flight. So.
Am I right that camera is essentially upside down so that the controls are on the bottom now so that you can use them with the glove?
Yeah, and you can use, I think we were looking at it yesterday, I think I used the thing with now this shows with being used with the right hand here. But
Have we gotten that wrong?
I think that's wrong maybe too. I think it was used with the left hand because we looked at it yesterday and I couldn't remember for sure, but I think the way it's rigged, they used to strip the shutter with the forefinger and transported the film with the thumb. And those are the first handheld pictures ever taken in space were with that.
What else were you being asked to do during your mission? What kinds of tasks did you have?
Well, the early flights, as Scott mentioned earlier, I think, that was just, the objective was to see, could we do this? Can man operate in space and be an integral part of the machine and the whole mission in space? And that's what we were trying to do. We had some things like another camera that was to take a spectrographic picture of the sun and some things like that that were researched even on those early flights. But the main thing was to determine whether we could do this and what role man could play and define man's role in space flight. And of course, through the years, we've now transitioned over to where space flight is a place to do basic research now. And so that I was limited in what I could do somewhat on my flight because we had a failure of the automatic control system at the end of the first orbit. And NASA had a policy at that time, you made a backup for any critical path system. And fortunately, they had done that with the control system, and so the automatic system was supposed to control wasn't working. A little thruster was stuck and was going to waste fuel, and I was going to have to end the mission early. And but it was able to cut all that off and go to manual control, and that was the what I did then the last two orbits. And so I was rather busy, didn't get to do some of the other things that I might otherwise have done. The picture you're looking at there, though, shows the hand controller down here on the lower right side with the hand on it. And I might indicate over on the left side, if you see the handle over there with a little thumb button on top of it, that was the one that was the abort switch. If you're launching and something was going wrong and the automatic system didn't pick it up, you could punch that little button on top and swing it 45 degrees to the outside, and that would set off a detachment and a rocket tower that pulled the whole spacecraft away from the booster that you thought was blowing up. And so you rode all during launch with your hand on that left one over there, and that was called
panic button.
the chicken switch.
One thing about what I was asked to do, we have mentioned that there were so many unknowns in those days. One of the unknowns was whether the body could metabolize food.
Yeah.
It was an unknown. The medics asked me to eat, and I ate some pap from a toothpaste tube, just like baby food, and it was radioactive, so that it could be traced through the body to make sure that peristalsis at 0G still worked, and that you'd be able to metabolize whatever food you ate. That's an example of a very important unknown that was solved by these early flights.
One thing I might mention too on going around, back in those days we had big communication gaps. You were down, as I said, fairly low altitude, about 160 miles up, and so you went over the horizon from a radio station, from a tracking station. You went over the horizon fairly early, and you had no communication then until you came to the next tracking station, and those were all located along the flight there. So you were back in communication once you went through that. But there was, I don't know, probably a third or half the mission, I guess. I don't know the exact amount, but you were out of communication, which wasn't bad. People on the ground looked at that worse than the astronaut did, because you don't have people
They talk too much.
They chipping at you all the time. That's right. So it was sort of welcome sometime when you went off the station. Now we have during the shuttle flights, you have the TDRS, Technical Data Relay Satellite, which is up at a higher altitude, so that almost anywhere that you are on the orbit, you can either communicate directly with the ground from the spacecraft on the shuttle, or you can communicate with the TDRS, which will connect you with the ground. And so now you have all kinds of communication, and you never are out of communication. You can send TV and another question, and just as to clean that up too, was the people ask sometimes about the number of computers we had on board the Mercury spacecraft. And the answer, of course, is 0. We didn't have any at all, and the computers back in those days were rare enough that they were, the big ones had a name, and I think the one up at Johnsville, as I recall, was Computer Typhoon. That's what they called, that controlled the centrifuge up there. And if something went wrong with it, the tech people went out in an area about half the size of a gymnasium and got up on their ladders to find the vacuum tube. The vacuum tube. And just your cell phone that probably 2/3 of you have in your pocket right now, your cell phone has a bigger computing capacity, I guess, than that computer typhoon did back in those days by several times over.
I know that both of your flights were eventful. You took manual control of the vehicle, and the Senator, you've had issues with the Fireflies. I'm watching a clock, and I know that our audience also wants a chance to ask you some questions, so I'm going to have to bring you back to Earth. Can you tell us how you bring a Mercury capsule from orbit back to recovery?
Well, when you're in orbit, you're balancing out. The reason you need that kind of speed going around the Earth is basically, if you look at it like centrifugal force. If you had something on the end of a string swung around, you feel the force. Well, think of gravity. If you could take a spacecraft up there and just set it up there in space and cut it loose, it would fall toward Earth. Now, if you get up to speed, though, where it's either the land is dropping away underneath you at the same rate you're going around, or look at it as though the pull on the spacecraft of gravity is just being equaled by the centrifugal force trying to throw you out the other way, then you're going around, and that's the perfect balance that you want to hit. If you go a little faster, you go into a higher orbit. If you go a little slower, you come down in the upper part of the atmosphere. And that's what you do on reentry. You slow down a little bit, and that starts you angling down a little bit. You hit the upper part of the atmosphere, and you slow even more, and then dig in and come on down. And that's the part where on the Mercury, we hit about 7.7 Gs coming back in at the end of a flight like that. And then you're falling straight down, and you go by about, you're supersonic until you get down to about 27,000 feet, at which time it's sort of unstable because of the shock waves and so on. And so you are coming straight down, and a drogue chute comes out to stabilize it at that time. And then when you get down to 10,000 feet, the main chute comes out in a reefed condition, which just means it's not fully deployed. Then the reefing is cut, and the thing billows out then, and you have the chute then lets you down the water. You're coming down when you hit the water, you're doing about 32 feet per second. And it's a good solid impact when you hit the water, but it's quite tolerable. It's not bad at all.
It's okay to mention the fact that the heat shield falls away after you're on the chute. The heat shield falls away. It's detached, but it's held on the capsule by a circular curtain with holes on it, in it. So it essentially is the bottom of an air cushion. Mm-hmm. As soon as it hits the water, the capsule comes down over the top of it, but it's cushioned by the air that is escaping through those holes. So it's a soft landing. It is, however, the only stress, if you can call it that, that we didn't simulate pre-flight.
Yeah.
But it was easily withstood. You could even say maybe not noticeable.
Yeah. And that the re-entry and that bag and it coming down on that the airbag that Scott just described, that's what happened on my flight. There was an indication, went to the ground to 2 different tracking stations, that heat shield had already deployed in space and that the heat shield was loose. And so what we did, we left the retro pack on because it is held onto the retro pack is held onto the main part of the spacecraft by 3 metal straps, and thought that would hold the heat shield in place then until some aerodynamic force built up on it during reentry. As it turned out, those two different stations that got these signals on the ground, that was an erroneous signal, we found out later, but we let the retro pack burn off then during reentry. And you're getting up, you're out about an ionized layer out ahead of the spacecraft is about the surface of, something like the surface of the sun, about 9,000 or 9,500 degrees, and about 3,000 on the heat shield, and it ablates away, it burns away and carries the heat off as you come down. So made for a very interesting re-entry from where I was, because I could see these burning chunks going back by the window, and couldn't be absolutely certain whether they were the heat shield or the retro pack. And obviously they were the retro pack, or I wouldn't be here tonight. So anyway, and you can look if you look on the Mercury spacecraft, Friendship 7, it's out there in the gallery in the main gallery, and look up on the heat shield, and you can see the burn pattern and see where the center of pressure was, and see the flow of the ablated material out from it. And that was later on Mercury on Gemini flights and on Apollo, they used that as you deliberately misalign, or you deliberately place the center of gravity off of that center of pressure, so you then could guide the spacecraft coming down. And that's what they used later on. But on Mercury, we took just a ballistic. Once the retros were fired, it was ballistic. You didn't have any control of it from then on. You're just going to ride it in from there on. And that was the reentry.
What John mentioned he saw through the window with the retro pack burning up was a beautiful sight, I'm sure, with all of the colors coming from all of the metals that were involved in the abolition of his heat shield. I didn't have a lot of those colors, but I got a bunch of colors in the ionized stream of air going on behind me, and that's a beautiful sight.
Yeah.
But it was soon to be followed by another sight, which I think both of us will say is more beautiful, and that's one of the fully inflated parachute.
That's right. And you can look out that window, it's right here, and you're looking right up, and you see that parachute deploy. That's the prettiest thing you ever saw. That's right.
When do you feel like you're safely home? Splashdown, or does it come after that?
Oh yeah, I think I felt that once I was down, I knew I'd get picked up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sitting on the water is fine.
Yeah.
Well, we're delighted to have you here this evening to tell us the story of your selection, your training, your testing, and of these historic flights. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Okay.
We did go to Q&A now? Okay.
I will
Okay.
say I'll be back.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll get up and take
Then we-
something. I'll get up too.
We're going to we can do Q&A now. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions from the audience. You, sir, in the yellow, really yell.
The Mercury missions, you flew alone, obviously, and it's such a profound experience to go through that alone. I wonder how that contrasted with the Apollo missions, and Mr. Glenn, you got to experience flying with a crew on the shuttle mission, and I was wondering if you could speak to that contrast.
Yeah,
I'm
it
going
was
to
big-
repeat, I'm sorry, sir, I'm
excuse
going to
me.
repeat the
Okay,
question
yeah.
so that the folks outside and on the webcast and at broadcast can hear us. The gentleman was asking about the experience of flying alone versus flying with a crew. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the first flight, as we said earlier, was just to see if we could do this thing, and you're all by yourself. Second flight, I was fortunate enough to be on, and we talked about the aging studies earlier. But that was with 7 people, and we're up 9 days. And the mission of the whole space program had changed in that 100 and some flights between those 2 flights, 36 years between the flights. And we'd gone over to basic research, and we had 83 different research projects on Discovery. And Columbia had 90 later on flight before its accident. And so the whole mission had changed. You had 7 people on board and big space, and you could float around. On Mercury, all you could do was loosen the straps some to be more comfortable. But on the second flight, it was very different. The purpose was different. We cross-trained. We had lectures by the scientists to tell us what they wanted us to do with their particular experiment that was on board. And we cross-trained to back up each other on those experiments. I had, for 4 days, I had 21 different leads, brain waves and respiration and EKG, had 21 different body parameters being recorded and sent down to the ground to try and pin down any differences in my reaction to flight to those of the younger people. So it was a very different mission and very different experience, especially when you are up there now. And instead of a just under 5-hour flight, which Scott and I had, Now you're up there for 9 days, and you can float around and you change clothes and get more comfortable and go to work on your research. So it was a whole different flight and different purpose. And the G levels, we talked about G levels. G levels on the shuttle launch, it's a longer launch, about 8 minutes and 20 seconds, I think it is, at a lower G level to get up to that same speed. And so you're up to, and you never get above about 3 Gs on launch at any time. Right at insertion into orbit, you finally get up to about 3 Gs. Re-entry is only about 2 Gs on that one, but you start your re-entry clear out about 9,000 miles out over the Indian Ocean in order to hit the landing strip down at the Cape. So they're completely different flights and a different experience. And as we, the first one was a much more tenuous thing. And as Annie said, on the first flight, she lost 12 pounds. On the second flight, she gained 12 pounds while I was gone.
I see a little boy up here. Really loud. He wants to know, for you, Commander Carpenter, what was it like being an Aquanaut?
A lot of fun. It's an interesting place, the ocean, and we lived under the ocean for a long time, and we got used to looking out the windows in that underwater house and seeing fish and seaweed instead of trees and birds. But it was a comfortable place, it was warm, it was dry, and we did some very interesting work out in the water. And I guess what I'd have to tell you in a shorter way is that it was so much fun because we were learning so much about the ocean while we were there. That's what's fun about spaceflight. We're learning more about our environment and about our bodies. It's great fun to learn. And that's what we do in both of these programs. We learn new, important truths.
That's the important part of the space program to me, is we're doing research. You're learning new things. I think what this, put in a bigger context, I think this country got to be what it is by two things. Education, the average person is better educated, was back years ago, than most people in the world, and then we put more into basic research. We learned the new things first. And that little combination, it's just as true today. If we lose that edge in research and education, we won't be a leading nation in the world. It's that simple.
I believe we have a question from the Milestones Gallery.
Yes. I have a question about your colleague, Gus Grissom. In the movie The Right Stuff, he was portrayed as kind of a screw-up, and yet NASA appointed him or anointed him as the second Mercury pilot, commander of the first Gemini, and he would have been commander of the first Apollo. And I just wondered if you have anything to say about that.
I do right now.
The question is about
Oh,
Gus
yeah.
Grissom.
Okay, I disagree with what you said. I don't think The Right Stuff portrayed Gus as a screw-up. That's a misunderstanding of what the book said and what the movie intended to say, and it is certainly an error regarding the man himself.
Yeah. It's Dave, I don't think any of us really cared for the movie The Right Stuff. I didn't. I think they advertised that as almost a documentary of the early space days, and it was not. And if you want an accurate movie, Apollo 13, look at that one. That's a good one.
Yes, sir. You.
Even after all the training, were there things, I think this could be addressed by both of you, were there things that could only be experienced by actually going into orbit, things that were entirely new or harder or easier And then were these things that you were able to tell Mr. Carpenter about, so he'd be better prepared for his mission? Things that hadn't come up in training that could only be seen by duty.
The question is, with all of the training and the simulation that you did, were there things that you could only learn from actually flying the missions, and were you able to share that then with your colleagues who were flying after you?
We went through the early mission in briefing Scott on the second flight and what I'd learned on the first one, so he could take off from there. I think we just went through, as I recall, we went through every step just minute by minute. We had all the tapes and all the things. And they encouraged us those days to talk all the time, even though you're out of contact with the station. Keep talking, give your impressions of everything that we're just learning everything, and put your impressions down on tape. And those were there to be gone through in detail, even though they hadn't come down to the ground to one of the tracking sites. So we went through all those things in just every experience so that we could gain from mission to mission. That's what we did back then. Every mission built on the experiences of the previous missions or sets of missions, and you tried to make progress each time, and just like we did after mine, Scott went on and did other things and had other research on his flight that I didn't have on mine at all, and each flight built on the other.
As part of an answer to that question is, the only thing you can do in flight that can't be done elsewhere is prolonged weightlessness. Everything else can be very well simulated, but you can't get prolonged weightlessness without space flight, orbital space flight.
The young woman over here.
With the end of the shuttle era and the experiences you've testified to tonight, and you think the importance of education and research, where do you want NASA to go? Do you want NASA to go back to the moon? Do you think that suborbital flights like the ISS are more important? Can you speak to your vision for NASA?
The question is, can you speak to your vision for NASA now, and where do you think NASA should go?
I will field that one. Thank you. Jack, we got another hour here. No, I think you got to look back at this thing as to, and this, I don't mean to make this thing political, but here, just the facts of the case are these. Here's the reason we're where we are right now. And first George H.W. Bush, proposed on the 20th anniversary of Neil's landing on the moon that we go back to the moon and establish a base on the moon going to Mars. And nobody got excited about that, and it was sort of dropped, and there hadn't been much preparation for the proposal, I don't think. In January of '04, though, the whole mission of the space program was changed just by presidential directive and a speech at NASA, in which President W. Bush, said that NASA now is going to change their direction. They're going to the moon and to Mars, but no additional money. And the money had to come from within the current NASA budget. I know what I think of that. I'm not sure what you think of it. But anyway, you couldn't have any money for this great new mission. It had to come out of existing budget. NASA had to change direction under presidential directive and try and take it out of that. And also, he directed that the shuttle program end at the end of 2010, and that the space station be ended at 2015. Even though to complete the station, we have over $100 billion, just over $100 billion invested in that as the most unique laboratory ever put together. And yet it was to go down be ended by 2015. It's now been extended out to 2020, but and the shuttle, of course, is the extension of the shuttle. The shuttles are expensive. They run an average of about $400 million per launch, up and down a little bit above or below that, but that's about an average. And so they are expensive, and that was supposed to pay for the new direction of going to the moon and Mars. Well, I didn't, at the time that came out, I objected to it at the time. I thought it was ridiculous and still do. I think in our international situation that we're in and our competition, we have the most unique laboratory ever built. And to my view, I think we should be keeping the shuttle going. It's the most unique, it's the most complicated vehicle ever put together by human beings to get us back and forth. And by ending it, now we have no way within our own country after July 8th, which will be the last shuttle launch, we have no way of getting to our own space station. And so we're paying 60-some million, I think it's 65 point something or other million dollars per astronaut to the Russians to put our people, to have our people have to go over there and get on the Soyuz to be transported up and back, and we pay 65 million per individual to go up and back. And that comes out to, whatever that figures out to, close to $1 billion a year, I guess, because there are 2 flight crews of 6 will change each year, twice a year. So there'll be 12 people a year on a normal year. But the reason I just object strongly is I think that this nation will go up or down, as I said earlier, on education and basic research. And here we have the most unusual research capability that's ever been put together by human beings. Chinese see this. They have a space station planned already and are moving in that direction. They have a moon base planned. I don't think we're in a position where we can say the space program should have unlimited money, certainly not. But I hated to see us take this, after all this effort that we did in putting that station up there, the greatest engineering marvel of all time, international cooperation, 15 nations beside us involved with it, and now we're not making maximum use of it, and I just don't think that's the way we ought to go. So I would much rather see us continue the way we were. I think it's important internationally in our relations with other nations. I think it's important just from a basic research standpoint of what we can learn there in a time period when we're trying to encourage research and innovation so that we don't become a second-rate power. And it's one of those things that I think we should be maximizing instead of planning to cut it down. We just got the thing completed here in this past year, and there were a lot of problems with it, but we've invested $100 billion in the thing, and our colleague nations, the other 15 nations involved, have put in about another 12 to 15. So there's a $115 billion investment that we're not maximizing by being able to use our own vehicle to go when we want to go back and forth to this research station. So that's my view. So, anyway.
We're not going to get a better summary than that to end on. Statistics show that education that takes place in a museum environment has a greater potential of being a lasting memory, and that's certainly the case here tonight. We want to thank you two for sharing with us.
Could I say a word? I want to, Jack he doesn't never toots his own horn. I think he should give one of these lectures one of these days on his experience, because he's had long experience. Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. He was over at NASA, in a deputy spot over there, and here running this. He's done a wonderful job with this, and I think is a real key factor in education of our young people and deserves a lot of credit.
Thank you very much, sir. But I'm in charge tonight, so we're going to put this to an end. We have a small token for you. Not so small. It's actually pretty heavy. But it's a National Air and Space Museum autobiography. Since you wrote the foreword, Senator, you probably recognize this book. But we'd like each of you to have a copy, and we'll send it to you. You don't have to carry it in your luggage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for what we knew was going to be a great evening. It's this is the Hall of Heroes. This is where it all takes place, and you certainly are two of the leading individuals who have taken this country to great things in air and space, but in many other ways. And so we are indebted to you for sharing this evening with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You take care.
Well, we want to thank, once again, Boeing for sponsorship of this evening's event, and we want to thank all of you for being here tonight. and for supporting our programs, and we're going to continue to bring this quality throughout the years ahead, and stick with us, and we'll have a great time together. Please exit via the rear of the theater. There will not be an opportunity to meet with the speakers this evening, so you can move on out and drive safely on the way home. Thank you very much.